Hello, hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We're waiting for a few more folks, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So I wanted to welcome you and thank everyone for attending the third and final event in the series celebrating the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I've actually been so excited about the fact that we've had so many students involved, but not only looking at the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also reflecting on how they can be a movement maker in their own communities and on campus. And so, first I would like to acknowledge that Schoolcraft College resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Potawatomi tribe, and that our responsibility is to empowering Indigenous individuals who are part of the Livonian Schoolcraft community today. We acknowledge the Indigenous ways of knowing and practices that inform the healing and equity work that we do. We also acknowledge that the historical and current realities of where we are located and the social climate in which we live must be a part of the basis that informs our focus and our priorities. And so Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life is a testament to what it means to lead during times of struggle and uncertainty, to remain resilient in the face of the unknown but necessary. As we are all looking back over the last few years of finding our way through a global pandemic and the losses we have all incurred because of it, and as we look at the racial justice movements that have spread across not only the country but around the world, we do not have to look too far to find ourselves at a pivotal moment in time where we have the opportunity to not only envision a new way of life, but for each one of us to make an impact on creating it. And so what I hope we all take away from this week is that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not superhuman. He was just a man that made up his mind that if anything was going to change, he was going to be a part of the solution. So this is the question that I leave for all of us to reflect on. How are we going to be a part of the solution to create the world that we want to live in? And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Catrice, and she's going to introduce our powerful speaker that we have today.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, I'd like to piggyback on some of what Tequila just shared. On behalf of the Office of Equity and Engagement at Schoolcraft College, I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today for, again, day 3 of this event. Today, we're grateful for the opportunity to spotlight the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Yet, we're here to stand against the times and the challenge and the controversy of our day. Today, I hope that you will be compelled to leave here with the notion of another one of my great and favorite civil rights leader, John Lewis, who once said that in order to redeem the soul of America, we will have to be prepared to get into trouble, necessary trouble, good trouble, that is. We have a leader here with us today who personifies the very essence of Dr. King and the countless civil rights leaders before him. He has defied the illogic of racism, discrimination, and the injustices that underrepresented populations face on a daily basis. Here with us today, we have Hakim Nathaniel Crampton, who is currently serving a 4-year term as Commissioner of the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission, appointed by the Governor, Gretchen Whitmer, in 2019. Crampton, first formally as a formerly incarcerated individual, is proudly representing the public's interest on this commission and the current chair of the MIDC Equity and Inclusion Committee. Hakim has spent the last 15 years advocating for juvenile, criminal, and education justice, engaging communities across Michigan and mentoring thousands of students and community leaders throughout our society. He has propelled the teaching and English language arts through the innovative textbook curriculum series of hip-hop based pedagogy called Slam Lyrical Education. Hakim serves as the movement and capacity building specialist for Just Leadership USA, a national criminal justice leadership development organization focusing on empowering persons with past criminal court involvement to advocate for systems and policy change. Within the criminal legal system, Hakim also works collaboratively with community-based organizations to improve the quality of Jackson's South Side residents experiencing poverty, gun violence, and disenfranchisement. For these reasons and more, we have chose Hakim Nathaniel Crampton as our keynote speaker today to share with you what it means to lead, what it means to be a powerful civic leader in a time such as this. Please help me give Hakim a round of applause.
Thank you, Patrice. I appreciate that introduction. And thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here in Livonia Schoolcraft College. I would like to acknowledge the organizing planning team that brought me here, and all of you for receiving me, and everyone that's supporting this college and in this community. I'm very excited to be here for a number of reasons, not only because it is an honor and celebrating of a great legacy of someone like Dr. King, but the times in which we live in today call forth all of us to be and aspire to be as great as Dr. King. I think one of the peculiar things that Patrice pointed out, or maybe Tequila pointed out, that Dr. King was not a superhero, right? He was not he was just anyone among us who had a dream, right? And a dream is but a seed, and a seed is temporary, right? A seed is a temporary thing that we plant in the ground, and once it begins to get what it needs of its water and the sustenance that bears its life, it ceases to be a seed. And that seed becomes a reality, becomes a tree. It gives birth. And that's what this focus is all about. It's about how do we, in our lives, give birth to the Dr. King in us? How do we become the seed that bears fruit and ultimately gives shade to everyone? So you heard a little bit about my story. So I want to kind of share a little bit about my story to kind of pivot to show you how someone like you, like me, could come from that caterpillar stage of life and blossom into become a great butterfly that soars over the earth, right? That reaches the mountaintop and can now overlook and see what no one else can see, and could then inspire people with that vision to say, look, I've been to the place where you all haven't been. I've placed the wings on my back. I've gone through the cocoon stage. And when you're trapped in a cocoon stage, it's kind of like you feel trapped, that you're in a place in which your movement is restricted, but it's the most opportune time for you in that moment of transition. Because while you're in that cocoon stage, while you're in that trapped stage, it is then there that you begin to realize who you are. That in fact, that you don't belong inside that caterpillar stage. In that cocoon, that in fact, that in that cocoon stage, that diversity, that adversity, I should say, the challenges of life that we confront, that in that cocoon that we are there to begin to blossom, to realize who we truly can be. Because we're going to emerge from there as what? A beautiful monarch butterfly with beautiful colors, showing everyone who sees us greatness and beauty and the nature that we are, the nature that we are made of. So I want to start off by talking about a quote from Dr. King, and I want to use that as the basis for showing you how that each one of us, like myself, were once a seed that blossomed to become a butterfly that soars over this earth. And the call of Dr. King, I think, is that for each and every one of us to contribute our seeds to the garden so that together we can build a beautiful, right, fluorescent garden that gives life and fruit, vegetables, sustenance to everyone. So Dr. King was famous for saying, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So whatever is happening to us here in our country, in America, right here in this city, right here on this college campus. Whatever is affecting us or impacting us directly is likewise going to have an impact on others in one way or another. And that becomes the basis from which Dr. King felt that he needed to stand up with his voice and represent others. Because if anyone was impacted by what was happening in America in the 1950s and the 1960s, the pinnacle of the civil rights era, if anyone was affected by it, then it needed to be known to the rest of the world that this is happening in America and it should not be happening. So he was able to step up and sacrifice himself to utilize his voice to plant that seed so that today we could have some fruit, so that we could be bearing fruit and eating vegetables and fruit and sustenance to ourselves. So what does that mean for us? Well, for a young man like myself, growing up in the 80s, the 80s crack era, there was a time in which young black males in America were poised to be unlike Dr. King's dream, in which he envisioned an opportunity for which people, little black boys and little black girls, could freely enjoy all the opportunities that this life had in store for us. The beautiful opportunities that democracy guarantees each and every one of us. His dream was to make sure that we would be able to see that and live in a time that no one will be discriminated against, that no one will be turned away for service, that no one would have to sit in the back of the bus, right? That no one would have to, for example, stand when the seat was available in the front. But because you were of a different complexion, you weren't allowed to take that seat. You had to go in the crowded back and stand. He fought so that people like me, when the 80s arose, that I didn't have to experience the challenges that I experienced. So what were those challenges for young black males like myself that inspired me with the dream to never have to live under the conditions that I found myself under? So Dr. King's dream continues to function for me as a visionary path of what is possible for me. So young black males in the 80s were poised, we were called a generation that was at risk. We were considered to be an endangered species, is some of the language that was used. Although an endangered species was considered to be an endangered animal out in the wilderness, that its species evolution was threatened by perhaps what man was doing, right? How we were taking over the land of animals who lived and roamed freely in their habitat. We were declared, young black males were beginning to declare an endangered species because of what was happening socially, the social climate of the 80s. Young black men were frequently at risk of death or incarceration because of the sociological circumstances that had now arisen in urban America. And what were those circumstances? We have to understand that Dr. King, after his assassination in the late 60s, it was a time in which America was supposed to see the fruits of the labor, of the sacrifice of Dr. King and so many before him. The civil rights era ushered in the opportunity to remove those discriminatory barriers to where African Americans and other peoples of color were not discriminated against and told that you could not eat here or you could not drink from this faucet. A very biased, discriminatory time in which economically, socially, academically, educationally, health-wise, African Americans and peoples of color in this country were repeatedly behind, starting from the rear, trying to catch up to America, right? So young black males found themselves in the mid-80s without the opportunity to enjoy those freedoms that people had sacrificed and lost their lives for. So young black males like myself found ourselves up against great odds of incarceration. We no longer understood that education was the most important vehicle and instrument to get us to the places we needed to succeed. We didn't understand that because something had happened. Something had happened in the early 70s, right after the civil rights era, that we still have not calculated and come to grips with what policies and practices that America began to do to undermine civil rights progress. So we have to take into account that once laws were passed, civil rights laws were passed, there were still people in this country that still felt that people didn't deserve the right to have equal protection under the law. And so therefore, policies and practices were implemented all across the country, from federal law to state law, that begin to implement biased practices and policies. For example, I'm gonna give you a great example. We were young black males, and we were involved in, some of us were involved in illegal activities. We were selling crack cocaine on the streets of America, very familiar here in the Detroit area. Well, the circumstances in which crack cocaine impacted our community is a very nefarious, right, investigative circumstance that we need to understand why drugs were able to circulate and proliferate in communities. In communities that were strapped in poverty, whom, for a young black male whose parents generationally were discriminated against, not allowed opportunities to access to education, opportunity to access to equal access to health care, and etc. Young black males like myself were poised to be disadvantaged from the opportunities that were available. And so we made terrible mistakes and began selling drugs as an opportunity and way to escape our condition. I myself fell victim to that. You heard about the story of BMF, Big Meech from the Detroit area, who fell victim to that. And we began hurting and harming our own selves by participating in the crack epidemic. As nefarious as it was for that condition to exist in our community, law enforcement did not know how to respond. Community mentors and educators, social scientists, no one knew how to respond to young black males responding to the harsh conditions of poverty in their community, the lack of opportunity in which they began willingly participating in their own self-destruction. No one knew how to respond to that. And you know how law enforcement responded? Well, we know, you ever heard of what's called stop and frisk? Stop and frisk is when, under suspicion that perhaps you're a drug dealer, we can stop you and frisk you to see if you have drugs and illegal weapons on you. What that created was an unconstitutional situation in which people's rights to their privacy were violated. Right? Not that what was happening, that we needed to stop people from carrying drugs and selling drugs. That was essential. We had to figure out a way to do that. We just had to figure it out at that time. So it's the way in which we begin practicing policies that are discriminatory and biased that hurt our community. That the call for Dr. King's dream must become realized in people who've experienced that form of harm. So this is the reason why I work in our communities today. I work with law enforcement to bridge that kind of gap so that we're no longer just bypassing law because we don't know how to respond, but in fact we come together and say, let's figure this out. Let's come up with solutions. Together, the people, the community come together and come up with solutions to figure out how, in fact, we eradicate problems from our community without implementing policies and practices that are discriminatory. It has happened decade after decade that we have failed to find solutions to the most pressing problems that impact us. So let me put that in forefront with my own life story. So you heard a little bit about the fact that I am now a commissioner, that I have overcome great challenges in my life. Well, it wasn't easy to overcome those great challenges because as I fell victim to participate in the 80s crack era, in 1991, I decided for the first time in my life, at the age of 18, that I was ready to change my life. So I left the state of Michigan. I went to the state of Wisconsin and went to Milwaukee. And I attempted to enroll in Job Corps. Job Corps told me, we would love to take you in and teach you a skilled trade that you can go on and produce a career with and live a life. However, at that time, I had a felony conviction at the age of 17 from carrying a firearm in Lansing. So they said that you can't come into our program until you have your GED. So I enrolled in Milwaukee Area Technical College to get my GED. Before I could complete those courses, I was arrested at a liquor store on the corner of 60th and Silver Spring in Milwaukee for a fight. Young kid, 18, myself, drinking, illegal, and I got into a fight. Once I got into custody, I was never ever asked, not once, about the fight I was in. I was only asked about an unsolved murder that happened 3 weeks prior to my arrest. An unsolved murder I had absolutely no knowledge about. Well, 2 other gentlemen were in custody with me at that liquor store, and they asked them the same question about the unsolved murder. None of us had any knowledge about that unsolved murder. Well, they begin then playing an interrogation game, a tactic that is used to actually accuse people who perhaps might be guilty of something, accuse them, say they have evidence implicating them, because if they actually are guilty, maybe they'll then admit that, yes, you have evidence against me, I'm guilty, I did it. Well, they had zero evidence against us, so they lied to us and said they had evidence against us to see if we would confess to a crime that we didn't commit. Long story short, a young man by the name of Mark Henry, 19 years old, he believed law enforcement that, in fact, we had confessed and implicated him. In fact, we never confessed. We never implicated him. We didn't know anything about the crime. He then confessed because he believed that we had confessed and falsely implicated him. So he then began telling a false story to implicate us, to save himself from a crime he himself didn't do. Long story short, I was charged with first-degree murder. I was convicted, and I was sentenced to 45 years in prison. At the age of 18, I had to figure out at that moment if I was going to dream awake or stay dreaming sleep. I decided to follow in the path and wake myself up, to figure out why and how I had gotten myself in that predicament, to where I was now sentenced to 45 years in prison for a crime I had not committed, but by poetic justice, a crime that for a young black male that I had become, I could have committed. So I had to figure out who, in fact, I had become, but who was I supposed to be? So it was then in that instance and moment that I began to focus on rebuilding me, to find out who I supposed to be in life. So it was that, in that moment, in that condition, that I began my own rebirth, to dream, to find a greater passion in life. It took 15 years for me to win my freedom. 17 years ago, in 2006, the Wisconsin Innocence Project was able to take my case to the Wisconsin parole chairman and say, hey, you have someone in prison who's innocent, who doesn't belong there. Presented them with the evidence, because there was never any evidence to convict me to begin with. It was only an individual's testimony. But there were eyewitnesses at the scene who came to court and who even testified that I wasn't the one. Who even testified that they see the people, they can point them out and they'll identify them. But nevertheless, we were still convicted. So the parole chairman agreed that I should not have been convicted and that I should be released. And in the injustice, and the justice of that injustice, I was granted parole. That was 17 years ago. Sadly, with our criminal justice system, it still hasn't reached fairness. So we still haven't a situation in which, let me tell you how fair this is to me. I'm going to ask you the question. Is it fair that, for example, a person like me who has served 15 years of a crime they were innocent of, to be paroled by the parole chairman who believes that the individual is innocent, for that individual 17 years later to remain on parole? I stand here before you, a commissioner of the MIDC, gainfully employed, working in my community, awarded across this country. I still remain on parole. I still have a parole agent I must talk to and report to every single month. Bro breathalyzer and urine in a cup. This is the epitome of our justice system today. And this is the reason why Dr. King fights, because we still have injustice happening in our communities. We still have policies and practices that should not be enacted. No one in the state of Wisconsin can give justification for why someone like me is remaining on parole. The state of Michigan has begged the state of Wisconsin to discharge my parole. It has not happened. Had a state senator named Getsky from the state of Wisconsin and went to the Wisconsin Department of Corrections and asked them, why will you not release this man from parole? He's been appointed by a governor in his home state. He's working in his community with all kinds of education, law enforcement, etc. Why would you not parole or release him from his parole? You know what they told him last year, before December? We'll revisit it after the election. See, there's politics involved, right? Because they were fearful that if they released me on parole, they would come back to harm the governor. We have to be courageous and get to a point in life to where we understand that justice cannot be stagnated because of someone's political affiliation, because of someone's career, because of someone's personal opportunity. But justice is something that must ring at the top. Justice is something that can't be compromised. We can't come to the table and try to figure out a compromise and say, okay, well, you've done good so far. Do good for 5 more years and then we'll let you off parole. Right? You can't compromise with justice and fairness. And so there's a few things I want to highlight before I finish about civic engagement, because it isn't only about our personal stories, our personal examples that give us inspiration for do what we do. Let's take it back to the foundation of this country. The United States as we know it was created through the Declaration of Independence, in which a country who hadn't been a country at the time, a people who were the subjects of another country, they felt that the injustices of the governance over their lives were not appropriate for them. And they felt that they had the right to then declare their independence from that. And to declare their independence from Great Britain, they declared a revolution. It is only a revolution of the physical proportion because they did unfortunately go to physical war, right? But fortunately because now we have a country. But what Dr. King represented in the fullness of civic engagement is the fact that at a point in time, we may have to stand up to our government and say, this isn't right. And Dr. King's approach was to do so in a non-violent way. And this is the call for us today to come together in dialogue, in conversation, in civil disobedience, right? Because we know what happens when we advocate for violence. So Dr. King understood that that wasn't going to get us to victory, right? So that we know that today we're a civil society of high standards, high morality, that we can come together and sit down through dialogue, through consensus. We can remove some of the systemic barriers, the generational barriers that harm us, that restrict people's freedoms and opportunity. And let's look back and think back to the Declaration of Independence. When Thomas Jefferson originally wrote the Declaration, he had other people to come and help him edit it behind it. But some of the most famous quote that we know out of the Declaration, right? It was edited because Thomas Jefferson originally talked about the unalienable rights. He described them as sacred and undeniable, right? Sacred and undeniable, connecting it to the fact that when we think about sacred and holy, we think about something that absolutely cannot be violated, right? And today when we talk about the Declaration of Independence, when we talk about people having certain unalienable rights that absolutely cannot be violated, the pursuit of what? Life, liberty, and happiness. That those particular three things is the pinnacle of why Dr. King knew that he had to stand up and fight for America's dream. For that seed to be planted, right? For that Declaration of Independence to say we declare ourselves independent of injustice. We declare ourselves to be independent of harm to society. And we declare that we have the right to be free, to pursue happiness in this world. But how do we do that if we all are involved in planting that seed, in watering that seed, and in becoming a fruit of that branch of justice that Dr. King and so many others sacrificed their lives for? So that no one of our personal stories in itself becomes the pinnacle, but the story of justice, the story of the fight for justice, and all the people like you and like I along that route of justice, that our stories become the story of justice, that our stories become the dream that we envision, that we can achieve in this world, in this life, through dialogue, through consensus, through education, through collective leadership, through collective voice. We're not always going to agree. Disagreement is good. It's healthy because it allows us to then examine ourselves, examine our thoughts, our views. When you think about the American Constitution, it was written by a lot of people who were involved in the slave trade. So how do we reconcile people believing that human beings have the rights, the inalienable right, the sacred right to be free, to pursue happiness, to pursue their lives? How do we justify that when we have a mindset that's contrary to that? So we have to now talk about our founding fathers and how much of a visionary they were And how much of that in itself hasn't been realized, hasn't been fulfilled. Fulfillment now rests on us. The responsibility of their shortcomings now rests on us. It now rests on us to get it right. The last thing I want to mention Dr. King's dream, I want to put that in the acronym, the DREAM. For me, determination and dedication really represents my passion for the work that I do, particularly with youth and education and juvenile justice. So Dr. King's dream to me stands for determination. And the R will stand for realization, to really truly realize justice and equity and equality. And the E, of course, is equity. And equity, unlike equality, has a little varied tone to it. Equity means that we provide everyone with what they really need, right? So if you need more assistance than I need to give you what you need. I don't need to give you the same thing I got because I may not need what you need. I may be tall enough to see over the fence and you may not be, right? So we need to talk about giving you what you need, but at the same time we need to talk about removing the fence to begin with. That's equity, the full conversation. And the A, of course, would be and, because it's very important that there's secondary things to go with other things. The last point is an African concept called Mat. Now, Mat is an African-Egyptian ancient concept, and they even have a goddess called Mat, M-A'-A-T. In Egyptian philosophy, Mat represents the totality of order, of justice, of truth, of fairness in this world. The Mat represents everything that we think the United States Constitution stands for, the Bill of Rights, everything that we understand the power of what it gives us as citizens in this country to live free and be free. That's what Mat represents. So that dream is a determined dream, a realized dream, a dream of equity, and a dream of the totality of everything we really seek in life, of order, justice, fairness. This is what we dream to achieve. And so I thank you all for joining us as we continue to fight for this dream the last over 50 years. I'll be 50 this year. And the dream started long before me. And Dr. King's dream, in order for it to be realized, each and every one of us must begin to plant that seed so that we and our future can become the fruit and the vegetables that we all enjoy to provide shade for everyone. So thank you so much.
Thank you. We would now like to announce that we are sorry that our U.S. Representative, Stephanie Young, could not be here with us today, but has been kind and gracious enough to send us a message through video that we would like to share with you guys at this time. After that video is shared, we would like to go over a few questions and have a dialogue with you guys, because that's why we're here today. We want to pick your brains, and we want to engage you, and we want to remind you of his legacy.
Greetings, Schoolcraft College. I'm State Representative Stephanie Young for the new House District 16, which now includes parts of Northwest Detroit, South Redford Township, and Southeastern Livonia. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you all in person today, but today is my second day of work. We have session, and of course, I couldn't miss that. So thank you to Schoolcraft Democratic Club and the Office of Equity and Engagement for putting together this amazing event to continue uplifting the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy of unity, equality, and the power of civic engagement. I have lived a life of public service, starting at the age of 4, when I first began taking food out of my mother's kitchen to feed my friends down the street when I learned they didn't have lunch food. And I have continued that life of service for the next 50 years, and I have continued working to improve the lives of those in my community and beyond. And so with that, I will close with a quote from the good Reverend Dr. King. At the heart of all that civilization has meant and developed is community, the mutually cooperative and voluntary venture of man to assume a semblance of responsibility for his brother. God bless you all and have an amazing event.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to share one quick quote from Dr. King, and it kind of piggybacks on what our esteemed speaker said today. Dr. King once said that the ultimate measure of a man isn't where he stands in moments of convenience, yet by where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And I would leave you with that before we start this question and prompts, because I want to roll the cameras back 2.5, 3 years to when the pandemic broke out. And most people will just think about COVID, but I'm eerily reminded in this skin, with this degree of melanin in my skin, of the civil unrest, the second pandemic that took place. The second pandemic. You see, we lived this. They said the revolution wouldn't be televised. Oh, but it was. Hakim's story is a living testament of why each and every one of us, especially here in this little sundown town of Livonia, why we have to beg ourselves to be compelled to do justice. Not just as an acronym, DEI, no, it's more than that. These are action words. Because we can say that we believe that everybody are equal. We can say that we believe that you're just like me. We're not. We're not. We are all striving towards the common goal of a better life, but we all don't experience equality and justice the same way. We're very comfortable here in this little space that we're in because we're protected. We're protected by our amazing police chief, Mark Engstrom, and the people that are here to protect us. But out in the community, community policing looks different. It looks like policing instead of us being protected like what we experience here. We need to push that past the walls of Schoolcraft College, and the way that we will do that fundamentally is by making sure that we do that with each other. We ought not think that this is not a you experience, because this is everyone's experience. When you look at civil rights, I know some people may or may not know who Dr. Martin Luther King was other than MLK. You ought to know that when you think about the word minority, it is not just a person in brown or black skin or in indigenous folk. We are talking about handicap. That could be emotional, that could be anxiety, depression, that could be a disorder, that could be physical, that could be ageism, that could be any population under the protected classes. Learn what that is. Because when we say things, we're often so off-putting, and that's what causes the majority of people to experience the microaggressions, the discrimination that people like many of us experience on an everyday basis. So with that, our Director of Equity and Inclusion will start off with the first question prompt, and we have some prompts, Hakim, that we will jump off, and we will beg of you yet again to share some more of your wisdom and knowledge. And if anybody has a question, please raise your hand and we will come around with the microphone. So this is.
So I would actually like to start with the crowd. So if there's anyone who has a question for Hakim, if you put your hand up, I'll come around to you.
Thank you for being with us.
I'm not going to stand up because I'm like super nervous. I usually talk in front of people. So I'm actually reading a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and it kind of talks about how there's generational trauma that's passed down. So with us as African Americans, like dealing with so many adversary, like different situations in our lives, what is kind of your advice to give to the future generation? Because I've had people ask me, well, what is healing for you? And healing, I believe, is like something that's different for everybody. So how people grieve for their grandparents is the same thing. So in your guys' eyes, when they ask you what is healing or how can we make the change, how can I better explain that to people? That way they understand like what the first step is, I guess.
Yeah. But this is a great question. I thank you for asking that. I'll try. I hope I ain't taking nothing from you, but
No, these prompts are for you.
yeah. So in my work, I'm a healing centered engagement practitioner, certified healing centered engagement practitioner. So about 8 or so 10 years ago, Dr. Jen Wright out of California began really exploring the idea of how do we really approach epigenetics. What she's talking about is epigenetics, and epigenetics is the science that generationally trauma can be passed down through our genes, meaning that what, for example, some of our Jewish brothers and sisters experienced in the Holocaust could be passed down to their current now grandchildren, whom they could still have a sense of feeling of some of the things that their grandparents recently experienced, right? They have a connection to it. It's epigenetically embedded in them. Same thing with African Americans and many people. It happens with all of us. With any humans, we can pass down epigenetically trauma, experiences, memories are embedded in our genes. It's been scientifically proven. It's called epigenetics. So healing-centered engagement is an approach to try to figure out how do we center our healing in our lives under the conditions we find ourselves in America, in which some of the trauma is continuous, right? Meaning that, for example, the trauma that was imposed upon African Americans and their living conditions, we call that redlining, meaning that banks and mortgage companies worked together to create red lines around neighborhoods to prevent African Americans and other people of color from living in certain neighborhoods. And so what ended up happening generationally, African Americans began isolated and segregated in little confined ghettos, so to speak. So the conditions that occur in those conditions, in those sociological environments, are handed down genetically. So that the feelings that people had in the 1940s and 50s, the experiences they had with being attacked by dogs, civil rights, and all the way back to slavery, that those things still persist in our lives and cause us to have shame, fear, and because the shame and the fear is sustained. For example, I'll give you a great example. When an African American, for example, I'm sure it happens to our distinguished employees who work here at Schoolcraft College or at any institution in America, what happens is that African Americans, we have a traumatic epigenetic response to working in a white environment. Meaning that we have a white supervisor, a white boss, a white board of directors, etc., who traditionally have maintained structures of power in which they have denied and discriminated against people of color. And so they ultimately probably come to work. And it's not because, it may not be because they come to work fearful that something's going to happen to them at work, but just epigenetically, black people, no matter where they go and work, and they have a fear that white people who are their supervisors, their bosses, are going to fire them, conspire to work against them, and cause them harm in their work environment. So they have to walk a very narrow line at work. At least they feel that way. It's an epigenetic response. So healing-centered engagement, our response to that is how do we center our healing in the midst of that kind of trauma, in the midst of that kind of reality. And healing-centered engagement uses the civil rights, and it's great you asked this question because it used the civil rights movement as an example of healing-centered engagement. During the civil rights movement, African Americans felt that they had the lowest self-esteem, meaning that America had created the cosmopolitan idea that African Americans were 3/5 of a human being, that they weren't worthy of the same kind of esteem and respect to be CEOs, bosses, to be the president of the United States, or whatever the case may be. So that low self-esteem kept a self-degraded mentality to where you heard the song, Black is Beautiful, right? In the 60s, we began to then center healing in realizing that we do have self-worth. So the healing-centered engagement process about this is that we have to begin instilling in ourselves a sense of self-worth. That in fact, black was beautiful and it was not therefore then worthy of a dog biting them, was not worthy of holes being sprayed on them, because we knew that by dignity, we had enough self-respect for ourselves as humans that this shouldn't be happening to us. And as a result of knowing and believing that we have enough self-dignity, self-respect, that we should enjoy the same freedoms that everyone else is, it gives us then the power to do something about the injustice, to do something about that which is causing the trauma, so that we can center our healing inside of the pain that is causing it. So therefore the civil rights movement was a healing-centered engagement response, so that people who were harmed by injustice, by social injustice, got involved in changing the laws. So Dr. King began to feel proud of himself and saying, I am black, I am beautiful, I have the right to be free. And when you get involved in that process, we get involved in the civil rights process, get involved in using your voice, voting, organizing people to fight for justice, that begins the process of healing, because you center that which causes the healing around your healing so that you can do something about it. Because if we got a cut on our arm, we need what? Band-aid, antiseptic, things of that nature to heal it, right? And so we get into action to address it so that it doesn't occur anymore, so that the wound disappears, so that the wound is no longer there. So healing-centered engagement is the process that we've been using the last decade or so, and you can look this up. Dr. Sean Jenwright is the pioneer of it. I'm a healing-centered engagement practitioner, and it is a process that we really, really want to instill in particularly black students around the country, because we know that the next stage of this healing process is going to be when we have healing-centered practitioners in our community actually able to answer these questions and then strategically help people get involved in action. I'll give you another example, a final example to that question. In Jackson, we had a group of students at our alternative school who couldn't complete their schoolwork. And they said that their computers didn't work. They said that when they get on the computer, some of the computers take 15, 20, 30 minutes to boot up, to get started. So they get to a class, they got 50 minutes in the class, it takes 20 minutes to get started, you can only work for 20, 30 minutes. So they couldn't get their work done, so they was never able to properly excel. So we organized them through leadership to go do a survey, to get into action about what's causing their harm. Do a survey. Let's find out exactly how many computers don't work. Let's find out how many students are impacted by this. We took that data then to the school board and told the school board, the superintendent. The superintendent then came to the school, physically got on the computer to try to log on himself. When he realized that the information we presented was accurate, he went and invested more money, bought new computers for the school. So then the students actually got relief. Right, so healing-centered engagement is an example and strategies that can be done. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Hakim. So we are running against time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. They may have to go to other classes or other engagements. But we wanted to just thank you all for being here. This is the first of a series that, we'll have throughout the year, and so we just hope that you all keep an eye out for what's coming. This doesn't work unless you're here to engage with it, because you help feed the work that we do. And so with that, we want to again thank Hakim for being here, and Catrice will close us out.
Thank you so much. First of all, to our esteemed keynote speaker, Hakim, I cannot say enough words about the impact that I know you've made on me while I was sitting here just listening to your story, about the impact that I know that you made on the heart and the minds of our audience here today. As I was looking around at individuals' eyes, and I was looking at your faces, and hearing the subtle inflection, the whispers that I know you wanted to say, because we want to cry out when we hear those stories. But the way we really truly want you to cry out, and not just the students, but our faculty, staff, and administrator, the way we can really truly move this mission forward is by teaching accurate history of not just African Americans, but indigenous peoples, period, minorities, period, different races, religions, cultures. It doesn't matter what it is, because I don't feel any less when I hear somebody talking about something that's anti-Semitic. I don't feel any less than if I hear somebody talking about the potato famine. At every point in history, there has been different levels of oppression and different groups that have been enslaved. But this is the group that it continues to keep going and going and going. And so that's why we're here today. And as we egress into Black History Month, we want to implore you guys to become involved in that and come out and participate. And the main thing we really want you to know is, of course, we exist beyond February. It's an awful shame that you want to recognize individuals that are here every day that are a part of the fabric of this nation. It's not even African American history, it's American history. It's built on the backs of minorities, and not just African Americans. Please understand what it means for people to be recognized. Please understand what it means when you're thinking and what that implicit bias does and explicit bias does, and the subtle microaggressions. Sometimes we're not aware, but you know what? I'm inclined to believe when people say, when I hear the word bias, bias is just that. You form the notion, and we all have different biases, right? We all have biases about one thing or another. But what we can do is we can work every day more fervently to ensure that we don't have students, like you or anyone else, that have that, because it shouldn't even be a query. I shouldn't even have to be worried about equal pay day and when I'm going to be paid by somebody that looks like anyone else in this audience. It's an awful shame because other people voted to make sure that I could have a payday, period. When is it going to happen? When is it going to be equal? Because right now, even right now, African American and Afro-Latina women, as we identify, are still the lowest paid humans on planet Earth. Let's be real. Let's be real. So I would just ask you guys to hold yourselves to a higher consciousness as we end today. And I truly, truly want to thank you guys because I know it's uncomfortable. I know it is an uncomfortable space to be in, but the truth generally is change doesn't happen from being in our comfortable space. It happens by coming out into this brave space, the brave circles that you guys are in today, that you came out and graciously allowed us to share this information with you. And we are definitely grateful and we're humbled by you guys being here. We thank you guys for standing on the right side of history today. Thank you.